if you can lift yourself up or lift other people up, give somebody the gift of something beautiful.
Artist Ellen Scobie states, driven by a profound concern for the well-being of planet Earth, I use digital imagery and sculpture to explore the interconnectedness and interdependency of all life forms. We are facing deep societal and ecological imbalances. I imagine humanity more integrated with biological communities in a symbiotic existence. I search for a poetic expression of such an existence. Happy March and welcome back, listeners, to Beyond the Palette. This is Whitney Rosenson, your host and president of Art Dimensions in Los Angeles, your one-stop shop for contemporary art leasing and sales. Today, I am talking with Ellen Scobie, a wonderful artist based in Vancouver, newly on the Art Dimensions roster. Ellen works with photo-based imagery and figurative sculpture. Wow, so much to discuss and learn about it. So welcome, Ellen. How are you?
Very well. Thank you so much, Whitney.
Thank you for being here today. Very excited to have you here. So we're ready to dive in. And how long have you been shooting and sculpting?
Well, with my immediate practice, I guess I have been at it for about 20 years, but I've always, kind of been arty or whatever, for lack of a better term. But around 2000, I was working in a architectural firm and doing a lot of retouching in Photoshop. And this was, in the early days of Photoshop, when really only professional photographers or retouchers were using it. And it wasn't the verb that it is now. And I was trying to think, how can I use the skills that I have to explore my own creativity? And I started taking photos and overlapping them in a sort of a collage manner, but very constructed. And definitely the influence of the architectural firm was coming through in those days. And that would, like I said, that was around early 2000. So, over 20 years. And I did that for quite a few years. And then in 2012, I met a sculptor at the shared studio where I had a place. And shout out to shared studios because they're just such a wonderful place for artists to
Commiserate,
see each
camaraderie.
other, mix and mingle, exactly, like the cross fertilization, all of that. And so I had been working in the digital prints, but what I was doing is printing them out and painting on them and kind of bringing them full circle. So I was becoming more and more tactile. And then when I met this sculptor, it brought me back to art school when I did study sculpture briefly, but never really, pursued it. And so it was just a wonderful connection. And we shared a studio for almost 7 years. COVID put an end to that. We lost the studio, we lost all kinds of spaces, and we're working independently. And now I am working independently in my own studio. So to answer your question, it's been over 10 years for the sculpture now as well.
So sculpture about 10 years, photography a little more than 20. And where were you educated? What art school? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Like I said, I was always kind of arty. I was doing lots of stuff when I was a kid. Just being involved in creative projects was really just kind of who I am. And I never really had a conception of what a fine artist was. Maybe because I didn't have any role models. There was a neighborhood artist, a Hungarian watercolorist who gave classes out of his home. That was probably like the closest thing. And, he's an old guy doing this stuff. I mean, it didn't, it wasn't something I related to in any way, but I was thinking about the applied arts. And there was also sort of a expectation, I guess, to go to university. So I was trying to figure all this out, and I went to the University of Victoria and studied languages. And after my first year, I actually had like one of these big,
Aha moments.
I did. I had like an incredible experience. I had gone to Quebec City for the summer on one of these language exchange programs. And I went to the Museum of Quebec one afternoon by myself. And it was a kind of a funny institution because on the main floor, they had historical items and the history of Quebec and all of that. And then on the second floor, they were sort of bringing us more into the 19th century, 20th century. And then on the top level, they had full on contemporary art, massive abstract paintings, and it stopped me in my tracks. I was floored. It was the first time I'd seen anything like this. I wanted to know what it was, who made it, what were they doing, what were they saying, and it redirected my whole course of studies. When I went back to the University of Victoria, I started taking art classes mixed in with the languages because I wasn't really sure what this was all about. But then I ended up graduating from the University of Manitoba in art history. And at that time, I guess my classmates and I, no one was really thinking about supporting yourself as a fine artist. It wasn't really a conception of something that you could do. People were either going into teaching or they were going to applied art or, something totally different. So I took the applied art route and I studied graphic design and advertising art. I went to England. I studied at the London College of Printing, had a whole other education there in book arts. And that took my career into graphic design. I worked in it many years, which led to the position at the architectural firm where I was working when I started kind of trying to conceptualize something for myself with the photos.
With the photography, yeah. Oh, wow. Okay. So you went from Canada to England, back to Canada.
Spain was in there too. I'd spent 3 years there with my first husband, and my daughter was born there, and there are lots of artistic influences from there. And then, yeah, just a few years ago, actually, I went back to the Barcelona Academy of Art to do a sculpture workshop. And these things are just so fruitful for the imagination and connecting with the artistic patrimony that's in Europe. It's always really inspiring.
Oh, so cool. You talked a little bit about you were always artsy, for lack of a better word. What is the first creative project you remember doing?
It's hard to know what's memory and what's sort of just stories I've been told, but my mom actually set me up with my first studio when I was 3 years old. She had the piano bench where, I could lift the lid up, and inside she had crayons and paper for me. So I would, before breakfast, I would open it up and, whip off a couple of pictures apparently. And I don't have any recollection of that, but she has saved so much stuff. And one thing that I found really interesting was that I was big into collage. I would cut like babies and pretty ladies, furniture, I guess, my domestic world at 3 years old out of this Sears catalog and then glue these pictures down and then draw the rest of the scene. And also from grocery flyers, I'd cut up the food. Mom would call it the my Andy Warhol phase because I used to cut out the little soup cans and everything and make
Oh my goodness.
pictures.
Oh, that's
And I
great.
thought, this is incredible because I am still cutting and pasting.
I was going to
I'm
say,
doing it digitally now.
right.
It's kind of something I've been doing my whole life. But to answer your question about something I concretely remember, I think it was in elementary school. You might remember doing a similar project. You would tear little pieces of tissue paper and wrap them around the eraser end of your pencil, and then dip it in Elmer's glue and stick it down on a paper. And you would create this kind of like little fluffy texture. I think we were filling in hearts or flowers or
Oh
something
my
like
gosh, I never did that. Okay, but that's another type of, I mean, it's not collage, but it's like, again, the pieces all coming together.
the pieces all coming together and also it's kind of sculptural. It
Hmm.
had this, depth and actual three dimensionality to it.
Yeah, yeah. There's another quote that I want to read before we start talking about your photography, because I think this is really indicative of if people can visualize this while they're listening to the podcast. As we live our lives increasingly mediated through digital devices, our material world is delivered to us in immaterial form. I look for the poetry in digitized shapes to describe lived experience. I often begin by working with familiar images of trees, underbrush, and vegetation. I extricate from these images the formal qualities I need for my composition. A crooked branch becomes a drawn line, a patch of sky, a color field. I love that. I mean, I can visualize. I mean, I've seen your work, obviously. Now let's talk about your photography. It's abstract. I would call it abstract photography. Explain what you do with the Photoshop or your process, if you would.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Yeah, struggling with kind of what to call it has been something ongoing for me for
Oh, it has.
forever. Yeah. So I studied printmaking at university, specifically lithography, stone lithography. And I really drew on that background when I started working with the photo collage because what I was doing was literally creating layers of imagery, just like a printmaker would, except I had moved this process digitally. So I was taking, if you can imagine, just something very simple, like I go around and just randomly take photos. I don't kind of set up a shot or anything like that. I'm taking flowers, trees, bark, water, gravel, anything that catches my eye, to be honest. I'm not that discerning. Then when I come back to the studio, I kind of run through the photos and just wait for one of them to kind of pop out in me. I'm like, okay, I'm going to start with this one. And I try to isolate some kind of shape in it. So that's what I'm talking about when I mean extricating. I'm not, cutting like a square. I'm looking for some kind of shape because nature has already created these beautiful shapes for us. I am just looking for them, isolating them. And then I'll take that shape, and if you can imagine building a collage, it basically becomes the first shape. And then I just layer it and I keep adding to it and building on it. And it becomes, like a lot of painters might also describe it kind of like a dialogue. You put some information in, you respond to it, you look at the color, the shape, whatever, the scale. And what I love about working digitally is there's just so many possibilities to try out ideas really fast. And I can always go back as well.
And
So,
re-manipulate or
or yeah, or say I go into a direction I don't really like, literally go back in time. So it's so different, like working with the sculpture. Like if things aren't going right and I start moving boldly where no artist should be going, that's it. Like you're committed. So I kind of have these two almost like cognitively different ways of working, which makes for, I don't know, it's just like the interesting times that we live in where we have our real life and we have a digital life. Um, and we're very connected to technology and the digital world, and we're kind of constantly mediating that. How many of us, like we're already kind of like cyborgs? How many times have you downloaded a cognitive task to your phone?
oh,
Multiple times a day,
yeah,
right? All the time, actually, right? Whether you're using the calculator or you're just making it remember stuff for you or whatever.
right.
So, we're already kind of like cyborgs. And so we're connected to the technology, we're dependent on it. But the other time, we're still flesh and blood. We need to be fed, watered, rested. We live in the material world and we're constantly navigating this is kind of zigzag back and forth. And so I see this mirrored in my practice between these two, they seem like two totally disparate things, the digital photo-based compositions and then also the sculptures, but really it's just kind of a mirror of, I think, the times we live in.
So beautifully said. And I want to just mention, I have your photography on my website. I do not have any of your sculptures, but, and I'll mention this later too, but you can check out artdimensionsonline.com. And on the homepage, click on artists in the upper right-hand corner and then scroll down to Ellen's name and click, and her page will open and you'll see all her images. So artdimensionsonline.com, Ellen Scobie, Scobie. Describe your aesthetic in 3 words.
I can say things like abstract, figurative. These terms kind of become meaningless, even though they are those things, but they're just kind of like so wide. I think the best way to describe it would just be like a mashup,
Okay.
which is right. It's just taking just disparate elements and putting them together.
Right.
And yeah,
That's great. I was also thinking layered, maybe.
yeah,
So is that an
definitely.
aesthetic? I don't think that's an aesthetic. Your work is a little bit, at least the photography that I happen to love is a little bit ethereal. It feels very kind of spiritual in a way, and the colors are very inviting, and well, people just have to check it out. That's all I have to
Thank you.
say.
Well, I'm really interested to hear you say that because the biggest thing that I struggle with, and many, many of us do, is the huge crisis we have on our hands with the climate change. And every day, all day, it's weighs on me. And I don't want to be always wallowing in these huge problems. And so when I come to my art, when I try to approach it, I'm like, today, do something positive. Like if you can lift yourself up or lift other people up, give somebody the gift of something beautiful. And so I do strive for that. Sometimes I find it really difficult with the figurative sculpture. So it's really good that I have the photo-based work to counteract that. Seems like I do take out like a lot of maybe angst with the clay. It's harder to throw pixels around. You know what I mean?
Right. Right.
Um, when I'm doing the digital work, and I do think about how to create like a metaphor for a more symbiotic way for humanity to live on the planet and to develop relations with other life forms. I've been very influenced by the writings of Donna Haraway and James Lovelock, Lynn Margulis, like these biologists and thinkers that talk about the earth as a living entity, and we're living animals on it. And we really need to rethink everything that we've been doing with humanity at the top of the chain and really suppressing and creating a lot of destruction with other life forms. So when I try to metaphorically think of what might this look like, I mean, I'm not a scientist, so I'm just strictly looking at it from sort of a poetic mode of expression.
Right. I want the listeners to know that I'm going to post some of the sculptural images on my blog. So
Absolutely.
we'll have that for people to refer to in addition to the
Sure.
website. The positivity, would you say that's what you hope people will get from your creations?
I'd really be happy if that happened. I mean, we're all living under so much stress, and God, we've all been through COVID. I mean, it's like, do we even want to say that word anymore? And now Gaza, and then the Ukraine, and everything. It's just too much, right? And politics, you don't even want to get into it. You can't, but you have to. I mean, right?
And not have a reprieve.
Exactly. And, mental health issues on the rise. They say there's so much anxiety with young people. People are medicated. It's just like we need to go out and hug a tree and put our face up to the sun and, be easy on each other and empathetic and kind. And you know what I mean? Like
I
just
do.
back
It's,
to the basics here. Let's take care of each other.
yeah. I mean, what a message you're giving or you're providing. It's interesting that you have your sculpture and then you have your photo-based work because they are so different. And like you said, you can throw clay, but you can't throw pixels. I mean, so the sculptural work is where you get your that side of your emotional energy out, and then the photo-based work is another side of your emotions that get to be put out.
Well, it is very interesting what you're saying because, when I'm in the studio with the clay, I think it's something just kind of, I'm not going to say primal. Maybe it is primal. I mean, humans have been working with clay for millennia.
Hmm.
And, I work with, figurative sculpture, like I'm making representations of humans. I mostly work with the female body. And this is something that connects me to an ancient past. And who knows, like, what's going on there, with the brain and what's coming out, and you're touching
Right.
and pushing and moving, and maybe it's just like an immediate kind of response. You feel something and you can immediately create some kind of a shape. Having said that, if I'm like upset about something or in a really bad mood or whatever, it's probably not a good time to go to the studio. Like I will go, but I probably just clean up or maybe just mope, just hang out. What I find happens often is I approach the sculpture with the same kind of thinking, like, oh, I'm gonna, the human experience isn't all about burden, for God's sake. Like, well, where's the joy here? And I'll purposely set out to do something like, what's a joyful pose? Or how can I express, power or something? And I start off on that path, but when you know it, I don't know what happens, but I end up with like something that is just heavier
You're not pleased with,
than
yeah.
I intended.
Or not what you intended, yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. I just kind of go with it. And then if I need to take a break, maybe I'll go back to the digital work. But I have to say, it can happen with doing the digital work too. Like I almost have like a visceral response to it. And that's where I kind of know, oh, I'm getting to the heart of it here.
How do you stay motivated to keep creating your artwork?
Maybe the fear of having to do something else instead.
Okay.
Like this is the only thing I want to do, even though I'm going to say, it does take a lot. It takes a lot of emotional energy, but this is who I am. I really don't have another plan. And I am kind of at the point in my life where, you kind of look at what are you going to do with the time you have left? Like the ephemeral nature of life, and it's so fleeting. And if my dad passed a few years ago, and it really starts to hit home with you on the fleeting nature of our existence. And I whatever, it's like, look, this is your life. If you choose, what are you going to do with that? And I ask myself all the time, and I never have any good answers. I mean, this is part of being an artist. It's like, what are you doing? What are you making? What does this mean? I try not to ask, is it any good? I ask myself, what does it mean? What's the meaning? What are you communicating? What are you doing with this? Why are you doing it? I can go down this like big existential rabbit hole with it, and then I just like, it's time to go for a walk.
I was just thinking that's great advice for emerging artists, to think about their work in terms of what does this mean? What am I creating instead of is this good? It'll just keep you
Yeah,
on
because it's
track,
very
I
subjective, and even it really it's kind of meaningless unless you want to talk about in terms of craft. And I don't say that in a negative way. I mean, like the technique, are you working towards, a high level of artistry in the actual crafting of the item, whether it's, you're painting, sculpting, whatever you're doing. If there's a language, and if you're operating within the canon of the language of the art form, you want to raise up your level. That takes work. That takes going into the studio every day. It's not going to just pop out of nowhere.
Yeah.
So we were talking about contemporary dance earlier on. This is an art form with a very high level of artistry, athleticism, and it's contemporary to us today. They're exploring themes which are meaningful to contemporary audiences.
Hmm.
And this is an art form that has required discipline. So I think all of us can take that into the studio. You've got to go in there and show up and do your best. I mean, it sounds simplistic. We've been all told this since high school, probably, right? But there's no secrets to it.
I mean, what great advice. What art do you show in your own home, or do you only have your own work displayed?
I show lots of stuff. I really
Yeah.
have quite eclectic taste. Yes, I do have some of my own work around, and my wall space is actually at kind of a premium because I have some big windows, and then I have a lot of books. Books is my art, like I have walls of books. So
Yeah. You have to find space around that.
exactly. So I have a lot of art in storage too. I've got like hammered copper lion from the Chinese artist that I knew. I've got prints, lithography, dry point, watercolors, brass rubbings, caricatures. I love prints. I love art with a message, like a political message.
Okay.
Oh, yeah, a ton of stuff. I have
A lot.
a lot. Abstract, figurative, historical, prints from my grandparents, carvings from Mexico, you name it.
Oh, I would love to see your collection. Which artists would you say have been your greatest influences?
Well, when I was at art school, I discovered Louise Bourgeois and Louise Nevelson, who really inspired me for their big vision, just their output and their, working as professional artists. Magdalena Abakanowitz for the emotional content of her sculptures really impacted me. And like I said, that was back in art school. And then for years and years, I really never had connection to a sculpting practice. I was busy raising my daughter, working full time. I really didn't carve out any time for myself for working, in any kind of continuous art practice. And then it wasn't until about 2012 when I got back into it. And really they were my biggest influences. The work that I do with the digital prints really kind of came about by, it's hard to say by accident because I had studied printmaking and that had been sort of the way into it. But I didn't really have any role models. The biggest influence really was working at the architectural firm, being in that creative milieu, and applying sort of the constructed elements really just influenced what I was doing.
With the photography.
Yeah. I just kind of ran with that. Like over, and when you look at my work now, you'd really have maybe no idea that's how it all started.
That's
Because it just
true.
became more and more abstract.
That's true. The images of yours that I have on the Art Dimension site are not, they're layered. Ellen's website is ellenscobie.com, ELLENSCOBIE.com. Please check out her work there. And on my site, Art Dimensions Instagram handle is at Art Dimensions, so you can follow us there. And our Facebook pages for Art Dimensions are Beyond the Palette and Art Dimensions Inc. And I want to thank you so much for chatting with me today and welcoming all of us into your creative world. I'm really glad we
Thank you.
got to
It's really
connect.
been wonderful.
Oh, good. I'm so glad we got to connect. Thank you for coming to Beyond the Palette. Before we sign off, is there anything else you want the listeners to know about you that we didn't touch on?
Just look at the work. Just look at the work, and hopefully, we can make a connection that way.
Great thinking, great advice. Thank you, Ellen, again. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in to Beyond the Palette. And I wish everybody listening a happy and healthy month and happy creating.